right, we're going to make some progress on Chapter 3, Supply and Demand. And if you recall, we left off after discussing the nature of that equilibrium point and how and why each of the individual curves would shift, right, and what that represents as opposed to a movement along one of those curves. And now we want to kind of start to put all that together and take a look at shifts in the curves starting from an equilibrium point, right? And a so-called four-step process that will kind of always allow us to figure out the ultimate changes in price and quantity that we can expect to happen in a marketplace, which is, one of the most useful things in terms of utilizing the supply and demand model is just making predictions, right? So if X happens, what are going to be the predicted outcomes in the price and sales of my particular product? Then we'll start to expand that and look at the case where, well, what happens when prices aren't allowed to adjust based on market forces, when there are government regulations, so-called price controls, price ceilings, and price floors. And then we will round that out with a rather intuitive measure of efficiency and social welfare generated from markets, the so-called consumer and producer surplus. So just as a quick reminder, right, when we're looking at that intersection of supply and demand, there is a process, right, by which we achieve that equilibrium. And we can see that again most easily with just asking, well, what's happening in the market when we're at any other point? So as a simple example here, we've got some points along the demand and supply curves in an imaginary market for gasoline, but it's the mechanics that are more important than the numbers here. But if we start at a price above that intersection point, for example, $1.80, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Again, just think about that movement along. As the price rises, the law of supply comes into effect. Suppliers are willing and able to produce more. Consumers substitute away from that product. They're willing and able to purchase fewer units, and that creates that excess supply, that surplus, increasing unsold inventories, sending that signal that prices should be lower, heading towards equilibrium. And if we imagine we go too far and end up at a price below that intersection equilibrium, as that price comes down, now consumers are substituting towards this product, increasing quantity demanded to that point on the demand curve. And suppliers, again, the law of supply says the lower the price, the less incentive there is to produce each additional unit. Quantity supplied comes down. Now quantity demanded outstrips quantity supplied. We've got excess demand or a shortage. We see those inventories start to fall, sending the signal to raise prices again towards that equilibrium. And in fact, that intersection point, that equilibrium that we see when we draw supply and demand, is better thought of as a center of gravity, right? It's the direction in which prices will tend to go, rather than an exact prediction of what a price is going to be at any point in time. Because as we saw with the list of demand and supply determinants previously, there are so many things that are changing on a day-by-day basis, shifting each of those curves in either direction, that any given equilibrium is just a fleeting situation, right? The curves are always moving. So just always think about it. Well, where are prices going towards equilibrium? By the time they get there, equilibrium is moved, right? It's a moving target. But when we sketch it out, or when we have a supply and demand schedule, we'll look at an example like that coming up. When we find that point, we should be able to define it, right, as that unique price that equates quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And then the other point of it, right, we'll come back to when we talk about that efficiency maximization at equilibrium. It's the unique quantity that equates willingness to pay and marginal cost. So if given a diagram or a table, be able to explain where equilibrium is, what it is, and what's happening at any other point. Is there an excess supply and excess demand? And what are the mechanisms by which that will move us towards equilibrium? So now once we've got that down, thinking of this equilibrium as this static point, this center of gravity, now we want to think about what happens when things start to change, right? So starting at an initial equilibrium, be able to track price and quantity reacting to a change in any one of those demand or supply determinants. And just an easy recipe here, we can think of this as a four-step process of determining how any given economic event that can be tracked to a determinant of one or more of those curves will affect our ultimate equilibrium price and quantity. So we start out, draw that static starting point, right? The supply and demand, the initial equilibrium. Then whatever the change is, figure out which side of the market is going to be affected. Typically, a given scenario, a given change is only going to affect one side of the market. There are cases we could come up with where both supply and demand may react to a given change. We'll look at that option as well. But typically, and especially on like an exam in an intro econ class, it'll be just one side of the market that will be affected. And then once you narrow that down, which direction are we going to go? Is it going to, if it's a demand shift, is it going to shift us left or right, decreasing or increasing quantity demanded at every price? Supply shift, same idea, increasing or decreasing cost of production, increasing or decreasing willingness and ability to produce. Then, once you decide that, you draw the new curve and you track the path from the old equilibrium to the new, being able to explain, right, step by step what's happening along the way. And as we'll kind of focus on, every shift creates an intermediate period of disequilibrium, i.e. an excess supply or an excess demand, surplus or a shortage, and creating that scenario of inventory adjustment sending a signal and prices reacting. That will ultimately lead us to the new equilibrium point, which we can compare to the original and say, okay, at the end of this, once we settle down to that new equilibrium, have prices risen or fallen? Has quantity traded, the equilibrium quantity, risen or fallen? And then that's when we can start to make a determination in terms of what are the ultimate effects of this change on consumers and producers, kind of quote unquote, who wins, who loses. And that's, again, what we'll be able to do with that, those measures of efficiency once that comes into play. So as again, a simple example, fish. Why not? Sure. So an example question, using that four-step approach, answer a question such as, how did excellent weather conditions during the summer affect the quantity and price of salmon? That is the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. So we, imagining we had data on this, right, that we would find the original equilibrium. So in this notation, that's supply curve S0 intersecting demand curve D sub 0. Here at equilibrium, E0, equilibrium price, 325, equilibrium quantity, 250. And again, you can just imagine, okay, month by month, week by week, that's what the market looks like before the good weather came, right? And so if we imagine weather conditions improve, that was one of the scenarios that we cited, right? Kind of the production environment, whether it be government regulatory environment, security environment, or climate, that was one of the determinants of typically of supply, right? So good weather, more fish, more bountiful crops in general. That should shift our supply curve. Which direction? It's going to increase capability of production, increase quantity supplied at every price. We could also think about it as the cost of catching each fish is going to be lower because there's more of them, so it'll be easier, it'll take less time. Either way you phrase it, we should see that supply curve shifting off to the right. And now starts this re-equilibration process. So comparing to where we were pre-good weather, pre-shift, at that original price, we now have more units supplied than demanded. So we've created, due to that shift, this surplus scenario. Okay, so what happens? At that original price of 325, day after day, week after week, there are more fish put onto the market than people want to buy. In this case, you don't want this to go on too long, right? So your inventories of fish start to increase, and you better get rid of those fish quickly because they're going to start to smell. You get it? And that's sending the signal to lower the price. And as that price decreases, we see those two movement along effects. Right? Law of supply, fewer units supplied at those lower prices. But now, as the price comes down, consumers substitute towards the product. Their budget line, right, pivots outward. They're able to afford more, that income effect. And we see that increased quantity demanded moving towards this equilibrium. So again, this is always a highly hypothetical scenario, right? So if the only thing that happens is there's better weather, but people's income stays the same, expectations, tastes and preferences, costs of inputs, all of those other things are constant, i.e. the true ceteris paribus condition, then we will settle down at this point. As unlikely as that is, that's okay, right? This is still a useful model because it tells us the direction that we're going to be moving. Due to that supply shift, we can expect prices to fall and quantity to increase, eventually going from initial equilibrium E0 to that new equilibrium point at E1. If along the way something else changes, we would have to adjust, right? But the direction of those changes can be predicted. So it's always going to be a variation on this theme, on the four-step process. As an exam type question, right? Be prepared to write out all of those intermediate steps. How does the market adjust? Why does the price go down? Rather than just saying, oh, the first two curves intersected here, the curves intersect here after the change. So that's where we go from point 0 to point 1 here. How do we get there, right? What's the logic of the movement? Just in case that wasn't clear, how about one more example? This time with a demand shift. So example, discussion, question, hot off the presses. From 2004 to 2012, the share of Americans who reported obtaining their news from digital sources increased from 24% to 39%. At this point, I think we call it about a 90%. The direction is still going to be the same, right? The effect is still the same, just much more pronounced here in 2024. Using our four-step approach, how has this affected the consumption of traditional news sources, i.e. print news media, radio and television news? So we can think of this as a substitution effect, right? The cost, we should say the price of acquiring your news from alternative sources has come down. The availability of this alternative has increased. So we're going to be substituting away from traditional news sources. And by the way, I spent an hour on hold with the San Francisco Chronicle the other day, trying to get them to add a print component to my subscription. I don't think it actually worked. So I'm trying to get them to send me the paper just so I could have something to hold and read. And I don't think they want to do it. In either case, What we should see, again, decreased quantity demanded at every price. That's the very definition of a shift to the left or a decrease in demand. So step number one, find the initial equilibrium. Step number two, identify the side of the market that's affected, demand for traditional news sources in this case. Step three, find the direction of the shift, a decrease, shift to the left. And then step number four, track the movement of the equilibrium. So putting some detail to it, right? At the original price P0, the demand curve shifts left. So now there is fewer units demanded than supplied. Excess supply, inventories rise, signal to lower prices, and that's going to push us towards our new equilibrium, fewer units supplied, increased quantity demanded, the movement along that new demand curve as the price falls will eventually put us at that equilibrium with lower prices and certainly a lower quantity sold. Obviously, in this case, there's no numbers, which is typically how we would do this kind of in real life. It's just more about the direction of the impetus moving prices up or down, quantity up or down. If we had, again, access to the real data, we would use statistical analysis to estimate exactly what that demand curve looked like, what that supply curve looked like, and predict where those prices are going to land, or at least the magnitude of the change that we can predict. Okay, how about one more example here? And this is a worthwhile example because it's a reminder, again, that in real life, more than one change is happening at any given time, right? So those supply and demand determinants are always moving, and it'd be kind of nice to look at a case where we can look at a combined example, one market reacting to multiple shifts at the same time. And we might see a discussion question like this using our 4-step approach. I guess it's an 8-step approach because we're going to do it twice. What does an increase in labor compensation, i.e., an increase in wages paid to workers, as well as an increase in digital communication, suggest about the continued viability of the Postal Service? Okay. Well, let's take these one at a time, right? So we should recognize that an increase in labor compensation, so an increase in wages, and this is, I could see why this would be a little bit confusing, right? But that is going to be considered a supply effect, right? So if Postal Service, along with everybody else, has to pay a higher hourly wage in the production process, that's increasing the cost of production, increasing marginal cost, and that's going to be a supply shift, a decrease in supply. At the same time, right, those workers are earning more money, so they might be demanding more of a product. But if we've isolated it to a single industry, so postal workers are being paid higher wages, we would assume that that is the side of the market that's being impacted, the supply side. So that's what we see on the left, higher cost of production. So every letter that's mailed costs a little bit more because we have to pay those inputs, pay our labor more. So the supply curve shifts up and to the left, right? So track that out. Fewer units supplied at the same price. We now have an excess demand for the product. That's going to put upward pressure on price, right? And that'll move us from equilibrium E0 up to the new intersection E1. But now at the same time, an increase in digital communication, right? Just like the last example, nobody's buying newspapers anymore. Well, nobody's sending letters anymore either. So we're substituting away from traditional paper communication sources, as it were, because of the availability of alternatives. Same price level, fewer units demanded. So the side of the market's going to be demand. The direction is going to be a decrease. What's going to be the impact? Starting at an E0 initial equilibrium here, fewer units demanded at the original price, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. A surplus is going to push prices down. So we look at these two things simultaneously. The higher wages paid to postal workers is going to put upward pressure on prices. People not wanting to send letters anymore, decreasing demand, is going to put downward pressure on prices. So those two things happening at the same time, that impact is going to largely cancel out, right? The ultimate effect is going to be indeterminate. Which magnitude is going to be greater will determine that. We don't have that information. So we could just put a question mark there. On the quantity side, both supply is decreasing and demand is decreasing, and those both have a downward effect on equilibrium quantity. So we would certainly see those two things combined reducing equilibrium quantity. And that's what we see here, right? So increased wages, supply shift left, higher prices, lower quantity. The shift left in demand, lower prices, lower quantity. As that, we could say, a taste and preferences or again, availability of substitutes is going to have that leftward demand effect. So to see kind of all of this at once, let's have a nice combined supply and demand shift diagram. And we're not sure the order that these things are happening, but if we start, again, the four-step process works the same. Find that initial equilibrium point, intersection of initial supply S0, initial demand D0, equilibrium E0, price, you guessed it, P0, quantity Q0. And then if we start with the supply shift, wages go up, supply shifts left. That's going to move us along the demand curve, reacting to the shortage that results raising price from E0 to E1. And then stack on top of that the demand shift left from E1 will move along the new supply curve, decreasing demand, creating a surplus at the new price P1 and bringing down to that ultimate equilibrium here at E3. If you did it the other direction, you'll end up, or the other order, you'll end up in the same place, right? So if the demand shift left first, we'd go from E0 to E2, then supply shifts from there, we'd go from E2 to E3. But the ultimate effect is a large decrease in quantity for both of those reasons, from Q0 to Q3. And where we end up with price, again, is going to be indeterminate. So we could have moved those curves in the same direction, but changed the magnitudes a little bit and had E3 below, E3 below that price level that we started with. All we know is that the quantity is going to go down. Whether the end result price is going to be higher or lower than it started, that we can't say because of the competing directions of those two shifts. So that would be the worst case scenario for an exam type question. And you wouldn't be given like a table of numbers necessarily to, at least coming from me, to solve this out with multiple shifts, but you should be able to show it on the diagram. And again, as long as you know the determinants and the directions, you can track it out. So just to kind of follow up on that idea of reacting to determinants, right, creates a shift in one curve at a time. It's important to realize, and we saw it, right, as we tracked those out, that every shift in a curve creates a movement along the other curve. In fact, that's kind of how we can think about how we would trace out a demand curve. It would be reacting to multiple supply curves. How would we track out a supply curve? We'd be reacting to multiple demand curves. So, and this again is just really a reminder about being careful with our vocabulary, right? Talking about movements along a curve versus a shift of a curve. And it's somewhat of an artificial distinction, right? That if consumers are reacting to a change in price on our model, that is depicted as a movement along the curve. If they're reacting in the same way, increasing or decreasing consumption, but reacting to anything other than price, that's a shift. So, for example, starting at equilibrium E0, shift number 1 from supply curve S0 to S1 moves us from equilibrium E0 to E1, and we clearly see, right, that's a movement along the demand curve. Something causes supply to turn around and shift to the right from S1 to S2. It's another movement along the curve, right? Movement along demand. It's not until something else happens, one of those demand determinants changes, that we would depict this as a shift in demand, which is going to create a movement along the supply curve, right? So in that case, when demand shifts to the left, suppliers only start reacting when the price starts to move. That's the movement along. So it's reacting to that re-equilibration process set into motion by the original shift. So it's worth looking at these examples, kind of putting pen to paper and writing down each step and having that terminology on the tip of your tongue, as it were, ready to go. All right. One more item for now. All of these examples, all of these scenarios are depicting the case of a free market equilibration process, right? Where the only decision makers that affect price and quantity are the buyers and the sellers, right? Well, as we know, most economies are a mixed economy where there is a free market equilibration combined with government intervention is what ultimately leads to the allocation of our scarce resources. And it's not uncommon to see restrictions on either how quickly prices can adjust or even the magnitude of adjustments that are allowed. So price controls are any scenario where a government enacts a law that regulates prices, that restricts the movements of prices. In other words, that doesn't allow the full re-equilibration to take place. And this can operate in one of two ways, right? A government can enact a law that acts as a price ceiling, which, architecturally operates as designed. So a ceiling hits a maximum, right? You can't go above the ceiling. So it keeps the price from rising above a certain level. So the market says prices should keep rising. The government says, no, we're not allowing that. So a legal maximum price. And a logical follow-up question to that definition would be, why would you do that, right? Well, typically the stated goal, whether or not it actually works, that's a different story, but the stated goal of a price ceiling is going to be to aid consumers. Right? Consumers don't like high prices, so if we prevent prices from rising above a certain level, that should make consumers better off. Prevents higher inflation, prevents that higher expenditure. We'll again see the full implications in a second. The other way this could go, right? Setting a price floor, just like in your room, wherever you are, that supports right? What's on top of it? You can't go below a floor. So a price floor keeps price from falling below a given level, even if equilibrium tells it to. It's sending that signal. So it's going to give some number that is the lowest legally allowed price for a given transaction for a product, a good or service. And the same idea, who benefits from that? Well, who doesn't like low prices? Sellers, right? So if we keep this minimum price, that's going to be keeping a minimum revenue per unit. So it's going to support the viability of suppliers of the product. So let's look at a couple of classic examples. As far as the diagrams, it's always going to end up looking the same, right? So the classic scenario of a price ceiling that we see in a lot of areas in the U.S. economy is rent control. Right? So we obviously have, certainly in the Bay Area, uh, a housing problem, right? In the sense of we have a homeless population. We don't seem to have a sufficient supply of affordable housing. So one strategy would be, well, if we need housing prices to be lower so people can afford a place to live, let's just legally set a maximum price, a maximum monthly rent on housing. That should make it more affordable, and that should increase availability of housing to low income individuals. Well, let's track that out. And again, no fault to the strategy or the end goal, providing enough housing for everybody. But when combined with market forces, again, we see unintended consequences. So imagine a scenario like this. Again, the numbers obviously do not track with rents as we see them today, but the effects will be the same. So imagine we have an initial demand curve for housing, specifically rental housing, D0, an initial supply, S0, and we're at this equilibrium point here, E0 again. Tack a zero on there, maybe I'd believe it. An example, equilibrium price of 500, so $500 per month in rent. And again, so the forces that we'd be fighting against would be a scenario like this, right, where population rises, incomes are rising, demand for housing is increasing. So we see that demand shift to the right, pushing prices up, right, from E0 to E1 at that new equilibrium. So we could imagine a case where policymakers say, no, we don't want prices to keep rising. We're going to pass a law that sets the maximum price, enact this price ceiling set at the initial equilibrium of 500. Well, okay, that does what it's supposed to do, puts a cap on that price, doesn't allow people to charge more than $500 in rent. But it doesn't stop the demand curve from shifting, right? So the demand curve is still here at D1. So the quantity demanded, the number of housing units demanded at that legal maximum price of 500 is way out here at, say, 19,000 units. But it doesn't do anything to increase the quantity supplied. Right? So the supply curve is static. It hasn't moved. And the only way to get more units supplied is to raise the price, right? That's what we saw from E0 to E1. It was the double-edged sword, right? Prices were going up, but also quantity supplied was rising. So we have essentially legally mandated a housing shortage by not allowing that reequilibration to take place. So every time there is a price ceiling enacted that is effective, meaning that it's lowering price below equilibrium, the unintended consequence is going to be a shortage. So there's the same number of units available that there were before the shift. We just have more people wanting to live there than there are units available. And we're not going to get into it quite yet, but this is going to create an allocation problem, right? At equilibrium, by definition, right, the market clears. So the last unit that's sold has a willingness to pay just equal to the cost of production. Every seller finds a buyer, every buyer finds a seller. Well, here we have more buyers than sellers, right? So imagine everybody that's renting an apartment legally can only charge 500, but they have 3 people wanting to buy for every 1 unit they have to sell. How do you choose who gets it, right? It kind of brings into play maybe characteristics that we don't want to be a deciding factor. Um, there's the possibility of kind of under the table payments, right? The willingness to pay of that last consumer here is way up at 700. They're only legally allowed to charge 500, but everybody knows there's some wiggle room there, right? So you got the extra envelope with $200 a month under the table. And then you also have the possibility of discrimination, right? So if a landlord has 3 or 4 people wanting to rent for every unit that they have available, they get to pick and choose who gets it, right? And who knows what distinction they're gonna make over and above willingness to pay, because that's no longer the distinction. So for our purposes right now, just be able to sketch it out, recognize the shortage that's going to be created every time we have an effective price ceiling. And that's what we're saying here, right? So if that price is not permitted to rise to reach that new equilibrium, we are guaranteeing ourselves that excess demand at that mandated price, creating a shortage. So you can probably guess what's going to happen if we flip this around, right? Now, the classic example of a price floor that we all see is in the labor market, right? So there is a minimum allowable price that you can pay to purchase an hour of labor, if you want to put it that way. And that, of course, is the minimum wage. We will look at that example specifically once we kind of put all this together. But for now, the other kind of classic example where you'll find these price supports, government mandated prices above equilibrium, tends to be in the agricultural markets, right? So there are good strategic reasons why you want to make sure that in your country, suppliers of food don't go out of business, right? That they don't get outcompeted by international trade, because you want to have a domestic food supply in case things go wrong, right? Kind of for security reasons. There's also, of course, political reasons that traditionally the agricultural industry is very powerful politically. So you want to keep those people happy. And who makes the laws that set the prices? Politicians. Who elects politicians? People with money. Right? So it all works out. You get the idea. But there are also good reasons for it, right? So imagine a case like this. I don't know why we're picking on Europe here. The US does the same thing in agriculture markets. For example, in wheat, we may have an equilibrium price here, and it is determined, right, that we need a higher price. And even more importantly than the level of the price, it's the stability of the price. That we need our sellers to know that whatever happens, their revenue per unit's not going to drop below a certain level, right? So it gives them that certainty and that stability. And that is kind of a built-in scenario with that volatility in agricultural markets, right? That when you plant your crops, you don't know what the price is going to be when you can actually sell it months later. So that's what's provided here. But we know, right, what the issue is going to be. If the equilibrium turns out to be here at E0, but the price floor, the price below which we are not legally able to sell, is here at the level PF, any price above equilibrium is going to have a quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded, and thus a surplus. So in the agricultural market, what this means is there's more wheat, there's more dairy products, there's more corn, certainly, produced each period than the market wants to buy. Right? So what ends up happening is, in order to keep the price at that level, the government ends up buying this surplus. It's either that or they end up paying the equivalent of the revenue to the seller and telling them, you don't actually have to produce this, but if you did, this is what we would have paid for it. So we don't need the corn. We just want to give you the money and give you that stability. But you see, it can go into, national strategic agricultural supplies. It can go into international aid. But the end result is there's more production capacity than is needed by current consumers at that legally mandated price. So there's an inefficiency that's built into the market, and that's the price that we pay for that stability and excess revenue to the suppliers. So for our purposes, just be able to locate where a price floor would be relative to equilibrium and what that market outcome is going to be, track the magnitude of the surplus, the excess supply that's going to be created, and say a word or two, whatever the situation is, of what would be the motivation, right? Who's being helped, or who is going to be helped based on the design of the policy. So our price floor generates that excess supply. Okay, so we will hold it off here so that the last thing we need to get to in chapter 3 is going to be our measure of efficiency or social welfare generated by a market at equilibrium, and track how that changes and how it's affected by disequilibria like price ceilings and price floors. And we will get to that next time. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.